Our primary reason for meeting today is to go through the Cabinet report for Thursday, the 20th of February, which includes the Cabinet and the annual budget report, but there are other items on it that we will go through as well. Can I have first item on the agenda is apologies for absence.
Got councillors Mark Tribe, Matthew Jones and Chris Evans.
Anyone else? No? Okay, next item is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests. Members? No? Any officers who are on? No. Okay. Item 3 is the prohibition of whip votes and declarations of party whips, which is the standard issue for all scrutiny boards. And item 4 is the minutes of the previous meetings of the 14th of January. Any comments? Okay, all agreed with them? Right. Item 5 is public questions, and we don't have any. Item 6 is the pre-decision scrutiny on the Cabinet report. But before we do that, I think it would be wise if we went through the items that are in the Cabinet report in the order that they're there. And I'll take the first one is the report on the revenue and capital budget monitoring on the third quarter. Ben, is there anything Mr. Smith, would you like to say anything on this report?
I'll be brief on each of them as you bring me in. This one, it's relatively straightforward. Third quarter is not materially changed from second quarter in terms of significant service overspending. You've heard my concerns all year. I continue to be gravely concerned about service overspending, and it's important because it feeds into the discussions you're going to have next, as is Cabinet, on the budget setting for next year in terms of some of those structural issues. The significant update is capital financing is going to be very beneficial again and is going to result in a significant underspend. And clearly that final tranche of Welsh Government money that's come in after December is very helpful. And you are undoubtedly going to be in a position as a council to receive an outturn report from me in due course to Cabinet, which is going to declare an overall underspend. But those persisting and pervading service overspends, which every council has got in social care, homelessness, and worries about the draws on education reserves remain entirely pertinent. That's probably all I need to say on this first item, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any members or got any questions on this revenue account? We will have it again in another service improvement, but if it's the only issue, I think, really, and this is the fact that once again, you know, we have a huge underspend of 50% really on capital, which is a bit concerning. And I think that's about it really on the and that has been the case in many of the reports that we've had on the quarters that have been given to us. Councillor Black.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. At the end of this report, you've identified a number of structural overspends. I think it is social services, and I think education as well. What's this? Place. Yeah. Are they being addressed? Are those structural overspends being addressed in the budget, which we're going to be discussing next? Are they actually, or are we still leaving them as they are?
So I have agreed a position with the relevant directors that the structural deficits are considered to be 3 and 2 million respectively, and they have been built in to the proposals for the next item you're going to talk about. The key will be how much can we get it back come outturn, and whether they can live ultimately within those structural deficits. But for the avoidance of doubt, Councillor Black, the figures that I've agreed with colleagues are in the budget proposals and are part of the major move since the January budget proposals.
I suppose if we've termed them structural deficits, we're not envisaging clawing them back by the fourth quarter outturn, are we really?
Correct. I'm anticipating that as a minimum, therefore, they are 3 and 2 adrift, and those have been built in. The issue is, do I believe come outturn that they have got them back to 3 and 2 million structurally over? Outturn is going to be materially over on both place and social services, well in excess of that. It is the read across into the new year, and I've agreed in conjunction with the Chief Exec, and as we've thoroughly scrutinised through with corporate management team colleagues, that that is a reasonable set of assumptions. But you're right, Councillor Black, there is no chance of them being addressed. Ordinarily, we expect the sort of old year to look after itself when we start the new. It's That's why it's very important that Cabinet and yourselves have due regard to those items that I've flagged as structurally concerning.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, can we then move on to the next item on the report is the medium-term financial plan. Again, over to you, Mr. Smith. I'm sorry, Leader, do you want to say anything on this?
No, I'll save my comments for the revenue and capital report.
Okay,
if we
I
come
draw
back.
then,
Yeah.
Mr. Smith.
So the medium-term financial plan, as you know, is the planning for the future years once you've considered the budget for the coming year. The January report puts them all together. This splits them out. It's a moving feast. We don't even know what the Welsh Government is going to consider as its final budget proposals, which we understand are going to be Thursday, and what procedural mechanisms there might be to get it through the Senate on, we understand, the 4th of March. Let alone future years. The assumptions I've laid out in the medium-term financial plan are broadly similar to those that were considered in the combined pack in January. It continues to make a number of assumptions. It assumes there is some UK growth going to happen in the UK. That is something that is clearly vexing UK government, Welsh government, and will vex all local authorities. Inflation is on the up. It's beginning to tick up again, and that will be a concern in the short term. Bank of England thinks it will trend back down eventually, but in the short term, there may be real pressures on prices and pay expectations. But I've set out a number of assumptions in there. The most obvious thing that may be of some concern to the scrutiny panel, which I should draw your attention to, as well as those general risks, is you have a continuation of the defer capital borrowing until as long as possible, because rates are proving very sticky. Base rates are dropping, but gilt yields are not, and therefore PWLB borrowing is not. So everything is pushed to the end, and you will see that as a combination of what's being proposed for the revenue budget plus what was set out in the January report, there is an intention to draw down temporarily savings on the persistent capital financing underspend, which then requires them to be added back in. When you see the MTFP then in the cold hard light of day, it magnifies the switch from significant underspending to needing to put the money back in because it was taken out temporarily, and also to fully fund the agreed long-standing convention with council, which we've discussed for a number of years, of sitting on my hands and not externalising that agreed debt. The 50 million for regeneration to date, the 25 million for Mumblesea defences, which is funded, but we haven't needed to borrow the money. And that's all that's factored in. There may be further capital asks in due course which need to be factored in, but that's probably the one item that would concern certainly some members of this panel. But it's a consequence of a logical decision. There is no point going out and borrowing from the PWLB today at 6% when everyone expects rates to drop. The key is, will they ever drop back to 3.5%? I'm afraid they're not going to get back to the 1% levels that we got lucky on before. That's the main item I think you need to be aware of. That's unique to Swansea in terms of its deferral strategy. The other economic risks every authority is facing going forward. I'll talk more about the immediate risks when we come to the revenue budget in terms of some of the uncertainties. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, are there any questions? Councillor Black.
Thank you, Chairman. If inflation's starting to go up, then the danger is that interest rates will also go up to try to counter that particular trend. So I think we're in a bit of a hard place, a rock and a hard place on that, Ben, except, of course, you're not borrowing money at the moment. My main question is around the interest repayments on capital borrowing at the moment. A few years ago, we restructured the way we repaid that savings. I'm just wondering, when does the higher rates of repayments kick in from our point of view as a result of that restructuring?
So in line with the decision taken at council, I believe in 2018, the flip happens in 29-30 in terms of the MRP repayments are higher under the new arrangement than the old arrangement. You've got a complex interplay also with banking all of the temporary savings, which are going into capital equalisation reserve in previous years, which have been used to then smooth capital financing. But I shall come back to that when I give you officer advice on the revenue budget. So you're still working to 29-30, and my assumption that you should not be looking as a council ultimately to externalise any debt till 28-29, or if any circumstances arise which enables a strike rate to achieve 3.5% or lower, my officer advice would be that's the point at which to externalise the deferred debt. On your first point, Councillor Black, yes, there is a risk that if prices and wage pressures go up, that the Bank of England will need to reconsider what it does in terms of base rate reductions. There is a fine balance between what I believe is mostly temporary inflation, may become more structural if there are issues in the wider geopolitical sphere. But because the Bank of England thinks that those pressures are likely to be potentially temporary and then trend back. That balanced with very anemic growth. Let's be honest, the Office for Budget Responsibility and all commentators have flagged that up. That anemic growth at the moment is a weight the other way, as it were. So I still expect base rates to come down. My fear is that yields will not come down as fast. They'll prove to be stickier, which proves that PWLB rates will be higher. Short term, it's great for us because the debt we borrowed for 50 years at 1 Whilst we're cash positive, we will continue to benefit from rates not dropping slightly. My ideal would be rates to stay high until literally 3 nanoseconds before you're due to go and externalize all the debt, because then you bank all of the gains on the surplus cash and you lock in at the lower rates. But hey, what the economy does, who knows?
There's also danger, isn't there? Because we're going to be hit by the employers' national insurance increase in April, mostly through the external suppliers we have for social services, etc. But that in itself will be inflationary, because in terms of other services that we buy. So the question is, will that increase in inflation caused by the national insurance, the employers' national insurance increase, be sustained, or is that going to just sort of go up and come down again as a blip?
So I anticipate the latter, which is why for the purposes of considering the MTFP, you don't need to consider it. You do rightly need to consider it when we talk about the revenue budget for the next year. In the same way we see with large energy price shocks and things, when you see administered price rises, you see inflation shoot up. Because that's then a once in a generation modal shift, you would not expect inflation in itself to persist. You have what's called the base effect when things drop out a year later. So I think it's pertinent, those risks for the revenue budget, less pertinent, and clearly the Bank of England thinks the same for those administered price rises and the general inflation pressures that are coming, and that they are less of a concern for the medium-term financial plan. But I think we'll come back to some of those risks of what is and what isn't compensated when we come on to officer advice and member discussions on the revenue budget. Councillor Black.
Anyone else? Councillor Jones? Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sorry, the sound in the chamber is not very good as far as my hearing goes anyway. Sorry, Ben, if I missed something there. You know, with regards to borrowing, I know Peter actually said that I think inflation is starting to tick up and so on, even though interest rates have been reduced slightly. Yeah. When we actually borrow for capital schemes in the future, what sort of figure are we talking about interest rate wise as a trigger? You know, it'll give us the okay. And as another option, really, what if it doesn't actually get down to that? What other alternatives have we got to actually borrow monies for capital schemes?
So quite simply, my officer advice remains that the trigger point is 3.5%. If you got an offer from the PWLB or the market at 3.5%, you would pull the trigger. The reality is, within operating parameters, you delegate to the Section 151 officer to make decisions in year. At 3.5%, I would pull the trigger. The real risk is the assumptions from the Bank of England. Its latest inflation projections are they do not see a terminal rate for base rates below 4. Many economic forecasters say 3.5. The problem with both of those is that you can expect yields on which PWLB rates are priced to be at least 1% higher than that. So the reality is it's going to prove harder to get money away at 3.5%. The reality is you've already committed as a council and an administration through the decisions, because you set budgets for several years, accepting my advice that you would defer 50 plus 25 million for Mumblesea defences. That is committed. It's not yet spent. You will have to borrow that money and you will have to take it from somewhere. And the reality is if you can't borrow it at 3.5% and you borrow it at a higher rate, you'll need to make proportionately bigger inroads to revenue budgets, either through council tax or savings or other efficiencies or other prioritisation. There's nowhere else to go. The reality is you've already committed as a council and through the administration to those schemes in the capital programme. It is extremely unlikely market opportunities will present themselves at a better rate than PWLB. So I am a little bit more concerned that literally the last week's Bank of England update in terms of quarterly forecasts indicates that rates are going to prove stickier than would be ideal. But my clear officer advice will remain, I would pull the trigger at 3.5%. Any opportunity comes for any money to be borrowed from any source which is 3.5% or lower, that is within my strike point because I've got permission from council to borrow it whenever I deem fit. And that has always been my consistent trigger point. I think it's going to be a challenge. I suspect I'll be sitting on my hands till 27, 28.
Leader. Oh, have you finished, Councillor Jones?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, you mentioned the MRP is going to, shall we say, reverse in 28, 29, I think you said, or 29, 30, whatever, where we will turn into a, shall we say, an increased level, where we will, it's been smoothed out since 2018. What sort of effect will the MRP actually have on the type of borrowing we actually make? I know we're actually waiting for interest rates, but if interest rates, shall we say, come down, I think you said, 3.5%, but come down to 4%, because of the plus negativity of the MRP, will that affect our capability to actually borrow?
Simply, no. The minimum revenue provision is based on my assumption of average asset lives, and by providing for a 2.5% MRP, I prudently make sure that the authority is setting aside sufficient money to repay all the debt over a 40-year period. All of the really cheap money we borrowed was at 48, 49 and 50 years. So crucially, the money set aside to repay the debt through MRP is set aside just before, a few years before it's due to be repaid to the PWLB. It wouldn't change my strategy. And frankly, at the moment, the most expensive money is in the 25 to 35 year rate. So if you were to go shorter on borrowing and end up having to repay it before you'd fully repaid the MRP, which would be a risk if you went with shorter term borrowing, frankly, that's the part of the yield curve you want to go absolutely nowhere near. That's the worst part. The problem we have and other authorities have is it's also expensive at the short term. Often you get long increases at the tail end of the yield and cheaper money short term. The money short term is not cheap enough. It's 5.5 versus 6%. It's not attractive anywhere on the yield curve at the moment to do any external borrowing. So you should be thankful that you can live off the fat of the land for a period of time and continue to bank those excess gains on short term lending, because our borrowing is fixed at 1 and 2%, and we still benefit from lending it out at 4.5%. It will drop down, but it will not make any change to my officer advice, Councillor Jones.
Thank you.
Leader.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It is again a bit of dark arts in terms of financial management, but Mr. Smith appears to get it right nearly every time. I think, look, as Mr. Smith has said, because we borrowed when they were very low and we haven't deployed all of that cash, we continue to make money off the cash that we borrowed and the money that's in the system. And one of the benefits of interest rates remaining higher is that cash return will continue to be higher than we'd otherwise profile, because we were expecting interest rates to come down more quickly. So if they stay higher for a little longer, they have an effect of giving us more money back in terms of the money that we borrowed and the rates that we get back. So that's a win. If it goes the other way and we're able to deploy the cash, then obviously you get to the point where you can borrow at a cheaper rate. So therefore you have a win that way as well. And I think the other thing to mention in all of this is, of course, the MRP, whilst the profile is unchanged now in terms of what's been set by council, the value of the payments has decreased significantly in real terms, because we've been through a period of high inflation. So over a couple of years, we've had 10, 11%, then 9%. So we've had a 20% impact really over a couple of years in terms of inflationary erosion of the value of what that figure that you pay back. And just to put it into stark terms, if you go back, in terms of the budgets that we had some years ago, we've seen a circa £200 million increase in the money that the council has to deploy through the increases in the funding that we get from government. So you've got to look at all of those numbers around this as well, because it's, whilst the number that we do to pay back has remained static in cash terms, actually the figures around it have grown. Which means as a percentage that becomes less and less of a challenge to meet. We still have to find the cash, and that's, Mr. Smith will always remind us of that. But inflation, given it's been high for a number of years, has had an effect of reducing the actual value of debt compared to what we have to spend.
I'm not going to ask you to class comment on that then, because I know what he's getting at and I know what your answer would be. Are there any other members who would like to make any comments or questions? The one thing I would ask, Ben, is that a medium-term financial, this plan is a living document anyway, and it could change in months, not years, in a few
I
months.
suggest it
could
might change Thursday, Chair. It being rude of interrupting you. The Welsh Government's going to announce its plans for next year's budget on Thursday, so the budget will change
Well,
and the MTFP will change. So it's very living.
that's why the budget meeting on Thursday is in the morning and the announcements in the afternoon. You know, it couldn't make it any better than anywhere in Wales. What I was going to ask you is, Ben, obviously our capital repayment, when we repay that money, it's unusual in many respects because we pay interest, but we sometimes some of the loans we have, we only pay interest and then capital at the end, or we pay. It's not like somebody's mortgage or you pay a sum of capital. And the one thing I would ask is at some time in the future, maybe not at the moment, if we could have an indication of when we pay back that capital, because I'll go back to about 2005, I think 2006, we eventually paid off the debt that we had for buying the land in the city centre, or the town centre as it was then. We finished paying that off, and the reason we'd borrowed the money from the Treasury, and we actually had accumulated enough money with them to pay off that debt. So if we could have some sort of indication about that, I think that would give members some sort of comfort to know when we're actually paying off these large sums of money we borrow in.
So very briefly, if I may, Chair, without going into too much detail, but just to give you some assurance, you're right. By virtue of borrowing from the PWLB, which is itself underpinned by gilts, we're not like ordinary borrowers. Almost all of our debt is structured to be repaid only at maturity. There are alternative options to pay by annuity or equal instalment of principal. There are occasions where it is appropriate to do that, but the vast majority is only when it's paid. To give you some assurance, the maturity profile goes from some debt is due next month to be repaid in full. It's a whopping £5 million. In the last year, I have repaid £20 million worth of lender option, borrower option monies, just used spare cash. So the £5 million that's due next month will be repaid next month. You would expect, if you had a prudent treasury management operation, for it to be short, and go up and up and up and up and up, and you take it as long as possible. That's exactly what we've got. But to give you a flavour, £5 million year one coming up. It's £5 million this year. There's a couple of £5 and £10 million repayments. This is on £600 million worth of debt in the system. The vast majority of, because I turbocharged it, when I took all that money in 2019 and 2021, I borrowed it all for 48, 49 and 50 years. And one of my predecessors borrowed some of the market loans. So they go all the way through to 2077. And I am absolutely confident that none of us need to worry today personally about 2077. But of course, you're right to make the point that we all need to be aware of what future generations might be picking the tab up for. But it is very, very end loaded, which is the best place to be in. But it's there is a maturity profile. But just to give you a flavour of what it is, those are the sorts of things I'm working on at all times. There'll be references to it in the Treasury Management Strategy Statement, I'm sure, at Council. But a further drill down to give appropriate assurance to scrutiny can be made available of the packs of stuff. I met with our Treasury advisors last week, and I've got literally every loan priced and date ordered all the way through from 18th of March to 2077.
As you say, I don't think we need to worry too much about 2027 at the moment anyway. You never know. Some people might live forever. Okay, thank you for that. Any other members? No? Okay, can we then move on to the revenue budget? And Nida, would you like to say a few words as we start?
Yeah, if I could, Chair, the revenue budget this year provides a record amount of investment into services. I think some £543 million into services overall. All of the key departments get an above inflation rise proposed as part of this budget. And that includes significant additional sums into education and social care, with social care receiving a significant cash injection to help deal with the pressures that we're seeing in the social care system at the moment, and specifically members will be aware we've seen pressures at the front door up over 20% in a year. So this cash injection is in response to that, to try and deal with some of the structural issues that we'd be facing in social care. Education, it's a little more of a complicated funding picture. So the headline figure is correct in terms of compared to last year's baseline. But you will remember that we took a decision as a council. We had a debate, I think, in this session last year around use of reserves to help our schools, because they otherwise would have received a much more challenging settlement. That meant that we topped up help for schools from the reserve and the energy fund, and that is baseline back in this year, as well as the extra amount going in on top. So, 23.3 million, I think, overall for the schools, but that it does include the one-off sums that we included last year, baselined into this year's settlement, to give schools the assurance that that is retained and will reoccur. Of course, schools up until the UK government budget in December, and then the flow through to Wales, were planning on the basis of that money dropping out. So it's a significantly improved position for our schools. In terms of other investments there, you'll see a continued investment in our housing through the HRA. I'll pick that point up now, Chair, because there's a big number in there again, 50 odd million going in to support continued investment in housing. We will wait to see what the final total is on highways, because we know we've got the local government borrowing initiative, which we'll know further details on in the afternoon of the budget on Thursday. So again, that will give us a greater idea of where we are with regards to that scheme and what it will mean in reality for councils should they wish to avail themselves of it. So there is likely to be further movement on that. We know there are also live discussions going on in the Senedd to get the Welsh Government's budget through, and that is likely to include additional elements announced on Thursday, which again we would hope are in the local government sphere, and therefore we will see some further benefit of that here. But even without the final budget, this is a record budget in terms of investment for Swansea services. Significantly above increases for education and social care in terms of above inflation. So again, some really positive stuff in there, but as you would expect, there are likely to be some further changes post-cabinet as a result of us absorbing what Welsh Government actually announced in the afternoon. So my intention, as you know, Chair, was to respond appropriately this year to try and make sure that we did as much at cabinet as possible, so you had as much foresight of what the administration were proposing as part of a budget. But the reality of where we are in the process means that there will be further changes in the afternoon just after cabinet has met, and obviously we will need then to reflect that into the budget that's presented to council on the 6th. So Chair, I'll end there. I may come back in for some questions, I'm sure, after Mr. Smith has done his bit.
Okay, thank you, Leader. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. You'll rightly all appreciate this is the one where the most focus is. It's the here and now. It's the immediate year. Echoing on what the leader has said, I want you first of all to take a step back. We've got a like-for-like increase in the settlement of 20 odd million pounds. A cash-for-cash increase in the settlement of 30 odd million pounds. The budget proposals set out in front of you propose over 50 million pounds going into services, and you see a level of council tax which frankly is much lower than neighbouring authorities. You are seeing a lot of authorities in Wales at the moment planning for near 10%. I've seen 9.85, 9.75, 7s, 8s. We are not at that level. The administration is choosing to strike a balance between affordability and therefore needs to draw money from reserves. The totality of draw from reserves does not concern me. This will be a test on what you've read and not read in the budget, because ordinarily I put more and more bold statements in. There are lots of them this time. There are real risks with striking a balance on the budget, including the uncertainties, as the leader has said. You couldn't make it up, could you, in Wales? But the budget proposals from the Senedd were meant to be in March. They've been brought forward because it clashed. They won't actually go through until at least the 4th of March, so it's going to be the usual get me fuzzy felt out for the budget setting at Council on the 6th of March. In terms of the report itself, I have made clear that my displeasure with two things in particular. I'm not holding back. I am legally obliged to give you my certification or otherwise on Section 25 assurance as to the adequacy of the budgets and the reasonableness of them. I am satisfied overall they are reasonable in the circumstances we have been dealt. But I'm going to draw your attention to the two technical bits of advice which are pertinent. The first is, speaking very candidly, technical term coming up, being asked to set a budget with no idea what our national insurance compensation is for any council in Wales, or whether there's any compensation for the spillover effects, picking up on Councillor Black's statement, is frankly pants. And I've said it in the report. Perfectly reasonable for me to say it, perfectly reasonable for every other treasurer to say it. An authority should not be placed in a position of having to guess an amount of 7, 8, 9, 10 million and who knows how many more millions for the spillover effects. That is not a good position to be in. It is an extremely unfortunate interplay between the UK government and the Welsh government and has left every local authority in a very difficult position. You even have a bizarre nature of Fire have put their levy up. There will be comments, no doubt, on that, but part of the reason they've had to put their levy up is they are meant to be compensated. They can't be compensated, so they have to bill us, and then we have to be compensated. And the reality is we don't know the exact detail until we get to next April and HMRC start collecting it, because we don't know. One of the perils of announcing something very, very far in advance. I am deeply unimpressed. I'm entitled to speak my mind, and I will speak my mind, and I will reiterate it in Cabinet and in Council. I should not be placed in a position of having to guess an amount for cumulatively clearly over £10 million when you include the spillover effects. Now, that's my main first rant over in terms of not ideal. The second one, which I must draw your attention to, I recognise why the administration is proposing it. It is to try and strike that balance between affordability and a level of council tax that is not at the 10% that many other authorities are considering. There is, for the first time, some limited draw from the capital equalisation reserve, clearly for the purposes of smoothing revenue rather than smoothing the capital financing costs of revenue. That is a fundamental deviation from the advice I've given for the last 6 years. I do get why, and having measured it in overall terms, I am satisfied that the level of draw from reserves is reasonable and proportionate, but it is duty bound upon me to draw attention to it being not ideal. It is what it is, but frankly, if things were thrown out, you're facing cuts or council tax increases, and the same applies when you take a step back. There may be things you like or not like in terms of what's in the budget. But if you get a settlement like for 20 million, cash for cash 30 million, and you put £50 million into services, there are only so many ways you can recommend setting a budget. So, I mean, that's another thing that discomforts me slightly. The draw over the years is not that large, and it's striking an appropriate balance. So I've said it in the report. I will continue to say it. I did warn in the January one that it was in there with a draw from capital equalisation reserve. So you must have regard to that, as must Cabinet, as must Council. You are legally obligated to listen to my advice on that Section 25 assurance. Don't want to overplay it. It's not. It is what it is. It's technically marking it and saying, is it what you would do ideally? Not quite, but I do get the circumstances as to what it is. The alternative is you'd be in a position that other councils are facing near double-digit increases in council tax. So with that caveat, which won't be pleasant for the administration, won't be pleasant for council, but it is my duty to give statutory advice and draw your attention to it. I am otherwise satisfied with those two modifications, that the budget proposals are reasonable and adequate for the purposes of setting a budget with all of the risks set out in the report. That's probably all I need to draw attention to, Chair.
Thank you, Ben. Obviously, there are going to be a couple of questions on that. Councillor Peter Black has got a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions, but I think Robert's referring to supported borrowing in terms of highways, and I hopefully expect that the budget settlements will also include extra money for social services at 1 o'clock on Thursday as well. So I'm fairly confident of that. Just coming back to Ben's statement in regard to the national insurance, which is a concern for all of us. My understanding is that whereas the English local authorities will have the money refunded in full, the Welsh Government is just going to receive a Barnet consequential, which means they may not have enough money to refund all the local authorities in full. Obviously, as Ben said, it's one of the great unknowns you won't know till the summer. But do we have enough flexibility in the budget to be able to meet any shortfall in terms of the compensation which we receive in terms of that national insurance?
So you're right in the sense that the English authorities have been given a figure. I think most English authorities would argue they have not been fully compensated, despite what might not be said. Similarly, the Scottish Government has now given a compensation figure to Scottish authorities, and I think, again, there is a difference of opinion as to the adequacy. You're right, the expectation is it only comes to Wales as a result of a Barnet consequential, which is, as you know, a long-standing invention and very, very high level, and is a very, very blunt tool for trying to allocate money. So it's not ideal. Yes, there is flexibility in the budget in the sense that I have set aside in my technical advice at least 3 million in contingency, at least 3 million in central inflation, but pay awards are budgeted at 2.5%. If they were to go to 3.5%, 4%, because inflation takes off, there is a risk they might need to be spent on that. If no further money comes for national insurance compensation, either for third-party spillover effects, or we ended up materially short on my assumption of £7 million, those would be the pots to go after. My concern is this early on in the year, to not know that first figure of, I've assumed £7 of £8 million being reimbursed, maybe £3 million worth of third parties, and who knows the wider spillover effects. That those spare pots may run out of defence lines very, very quickly. So there is some protection. It's prudent for me to ensure that there is some protection, but they can only be spent once. And the danger is there's a lot of things floating around in the ether that could be calls upon that. You are in a much more fortunate position as a council in terms of the level of central inflation provision for this year, and you had a very substantial boost to the contingency fund at last year's outturn. We'll have to wait and see what this year's outturn does. I'm hopeful, given that the third quarter indicates there is a little bit of capacity, that you may be able to put a bit back into contingency one-off to give a further degree of protection. But it's the main reason why I laboured in particularly my displeasure at the inability between UK and Welsh government to get to a figure that could enable an offer to be made. No authority should be having to guess a figure of plus or minus £7 million. It's not really acceptable, and so that's why I've said it. But I'm relatively satisfied that there is sufficient, as long as it doesn't need to be spent on 101 other things I could think about. But hey, that's the nature of a budget, isn't that?
Peter?
No, just on that, I look absolutely concur with Mr. Smith in terms of the position that all local authorities find themselves in at the moment, where we don't know exactly what we're getting. And I can tell you that Welsh Government are hugely frustrated at the point that they are unable to give clear guidance at this point in time. They may be able to give some more on Thursday when they meet, and hopefully they can. But the Barnet formula, we've been very clear that is insufficient to deal with the NI costs that we would see. As Mr. Smith puts it, it's a very blunt instrument. I think we've all had concerns with how Barnet works over the years. So I think fully concur with Mr. Smith on that. And again, I think Mr. Smith was alluding in his very colourful way there, as he usually does, to the fact that, we have pushed the envelope as far as we think is possible, given Mr. Smith's advice, to try and strike that balance between retaining a low council tax. And the point I would make on that, again, I will make it as you would expect me to at Cabinet and Council, is that we are still picking up the levy from the fire service, which we have argued for some time should be a precept. That is diverting again this year, close to 1% away from council services. So, the real rate for people in Swansea, if the budget is approved as it is, would be 4.95%. And again, we think that the fire levy should be something treated similar to the police precept, which does not come out of council funds, which is a redirect of money that could go into education or social care. So, make those points again this year. But again, Mr. Smith is right in terms of saying, we are, and we will, if we agree the proposals in this paper, be at the lower end of council tax in Wales. We will be below the average in terms of council tax amounts. We will be significantly lower than Carmarthenshire. I think we're going for 9.7. I think Neath Talbot are at 7%, I think. And remember, council taxpayers in Neath are already about £200 a year more expensive on average than those in Swansea. So, you know, Mr. Smith is right to highlight those things. But of course, we are also well provisioned. And, you know, that has come through many times. We are holding substantial reserves, earmarked reserves, which we have drawn some from, but in a prudent way, agreed with Mr. Smith. And just to say, you know, we will continue to try and strike that balance. But I think what Mr. Smith is clearly laying out here is that we've probably taken him to as far as he can go in terms of striking that balance. But we will see what debates come forward, I'm sure, at council.
Just one more question, Chair. In page 88, in relation to equal pay back payments, the paragraph says that we obviously put aside fully funded £15 million base provision for equal pay during 23-24. I'm just interested in, do we have any of that left, and are we making a provision in the future next year to cover that as well?
So quite simply, it is a statement of fact that I did set aside £15 million into the provision in 23-24. That is on the public record. It's a sensitive matter because to some extent it is subject to a live tribunal proceeding and other things, but I'm able to reference the 15 million. For the avoidance of doubt, the amount spent to date is precisely zero. As an accountant, I'm expected to be prudent and think forward about all risks. So at the moment, because there has not been sufficient progress by all parties, and I'll tread carefully in terms of what I say, given that it is subject to legal proceedings by a number of parties, I do not at this stage anticipate needing to add to it or draw from it at the moment, and I think we're still some significant way away from seeing any actual draws from that, because there is an equal pay process and an employment tribunal process going on as we speak. I probably won't say any more than that because it is a sensitive matter, but at the moment none of it has been spent. I do not foresee it being able to increase or reduce it, but I will revalue it at every appropriate juncture when something meaningful has happened, Councillor Black.
But that sits as an earmarked reserve at the moment.
It sits as an earmarked provision.
Okay.
It's cash backed like reserves, but it is fundamentally different in legal and financial nature. So whereas reserves can be reassessed at my advice to you, I've decided the provision. I have King's Council advice on my decision on the provision. Until I change my mind, it don't get changed. So it's slightly different and it reflects a different technical accounting status, but it's cash back. So if hypothetically it were never needed, it would ultimately go back to zero and it could go back into reserves. But there is a very fundamental distinction between the two. Think of it as effectively an ultra ring fenced reserve is probably the best way to talk about it, but it is definitely not in accounting terms a reserve. It is legally a provision, which is fundamentally different in construct, and I won't bore you with the technical reasons why that is.
It's one of the black arts, isn't it, not? I got Councillor Mary Johnson and Councillor Mike White.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's quite an easy question, I hope. It's about the schools, actually, and there's a lot of mention about teachers and, you know, additional national insurance costs between page 70 and 73-4. But it doesn't say about non-teaching staff. It says about local government staff, but where is the breakdown for non-teaching staff? If somebody could enlighten me, or could it be written better for council?
No, it can't really be any easier written for council because I'm guessing the figures anyway, because I haven't had any figures from UK government or Welsh government. All I can say, Councillor Jones, is that I have provided sufficient for what I think is required for schools for both teaching and non-teaching staff. So the non-teaching staff in schools are considered to be local government staff. So I have made provision for that in the school's estimates, but I'm stuck with the same position which I opened up with. If I don't know a number for the council, I don't know a number for the split between schools. I don't know the split between teachers and non-teachers, and I don't know the amount per school. It is thoroughly undesirable for me, and I'm sure it's going to be exactly the same for individual schools when they're trying to set a budget with no certainty of what their actual costs are going to be until June. So regrettably, I am not undertaking to provide anything more meaningful. I've done the best I can in an absolute financial vacuum from the interplay between UK and Welsh government. I think you'll have got the nature of my miffedness with the general situation that all treasurers face.
you very much.
Councillor Mike White.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Ben, just a point of clarity. When a person that gets discharged from the hospital and have to go into care home, is it the procedure that the NHS has to make a contribution along with the council towards the sort of costs of that?
Simple answer is it depends. I'm no expert on it, but the debate between what the NHS pays and what social care pays depends on how much is social care need versus continuing clinical need, albeit maybe in a care setting. And it is part of the joys and delights that Mr. Howes and all of his teams have negotiating with an equally cash-strapped NHS. So it's not certain that in all cases it will be. It comes down to medical and professional opinion as to how much is the continuing care element, which is still an NHS function, versus the bit which is social care and the bit that falls to us. And there is often a lot of discussion and debate between the health board and social services as to who should pay for what. It's just one of those unfortunate boundaries. And because we're separately funded, it's important and vitally important to both parties, kind of almost regrettably, unfortunately, missing some of the rather more important issue, which is making sure that the best care is available to the poor person who is in need of being cared for wherever that should be. And I think that's part of the reason why there is a press for a national care service aspiration and recognising that both should be funded and supported on the same basis. Some of those artificial boundaries are not entirely conducive to the best optimal outcome, despite best endeavours by both undoubtedly the health board and social services. So it becomes a bun fight between which cash-strapped organisation is going to pay what share, unfortunately, Councillor White.
Okay, thanks, Ben.
Councillor Paxton Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, everybody is concerned about the impact of the national insurance rises at the moment as far as the council is concerned. I'm just looking a little bit broader, wider than that at the moment in terms of social services. Obviously, we're highly dependent on external suppliers for providing domiciliary care. They're not the most profitable of industries, I guess, at the moment. And certainly, it's a low-wage area as well. Having said that, the national insurance contributions increase will hit them hard. And what have we built into the system to try and protect us should some of those firms decide that they want to discontinue supplying us? And basically, how are we going to cope with the situation if that does arrive?
So again, I'll
probably put another bit on that.
Sorry.
And obviously, with a 15% rise in the budget, do you think we'll be able to cover costs or whatever will be necessary to meet any rises that they might want to impose as a result?
So I'll be slightly circumspect because the private care market and the third sector care market, including charities and others who provide it, is subject to annual negotiation. So I will be slightly coy still, as I have been previously with Councillor Black. Part of my deliberations in terms of officer advice has been very much around the concern. I flagged immediately to cabinet members and in wider scrutiny panels that as much as I'm focused immediately on our pressures and yes, the downstream pressures in the wider economy, I am particularly and acutely worried about the impact on social care, tertiary sector, third sector, all those charitable providers who are still not likely to be compensated. And the point you make is a valid one, that the change in the national insurance headline rate, but also more crucially, the lowering of that lower earnings limit was probably too clever by half. It means that if you're in a lower paid industry with part-time workers, you are disproportionately impacted more. Part of my deliberations through discussions with cabinet members and with the Director of Social Services is, and part of the reason why there is such a significant increase in social care, is to put every penny, given this council is not at the moment due to be compensated for anything other than a guess for its own staff, to put every penny it could reasonably afford into education and in particular to social care. You've got a budget that is pushing social care to nearly 200 million and schools already over the 200 million pound mark now. That very much did weigh in my mind about the level of increase we could afford to provide providers with. It is still going to be subject to quite a lot of fraught negotiation. I'm sure the same position is going to be in 21 other authorities. Are providers going to be reasonably compensated for the pressures on national living wage and national insurance and be able to be demonstrably covering the costs of care. That is still a live debate, but rest assured, part of the reason for the very substantial amount that I have given officer advice that Cabinet should put into social care, that has weighed upon me. And although I lectured, and I will continue to Cabinet and Council in terms of my Section 25 concerns around what reserves are being used for, part of Cabinet's deliberations through the budget setting process to date and recommendations to Council deliberately push some of that envelope to try and maximise the amount that we can put into particularly protecting schools for national insurance and social care and the third party providers of social care. So I can't give an absolute assurance, but that is part of the reason why I have allowed Cabinet to push the envelope. I have to give my statutory advice saying it's not what I'd like to do, but given the hand that Cabinet has been dealt with those uncertainties, I am as satisfied as I can be. But ultimately, it's going to come down to an evidential argued basis as to have ultimately providers been provided with enough money under a contract to be able to provide care and remain sufficiently profitable. And Mr. Howes and his teams are preparing for all eventualities in terms including that concern of the fragility of the sector. I am satisfied that as a result of Cabinet being able to weigh my internal advice, about to weigh it on the record on Thursday in Council, that they have had due regard to those risks and concluded it is worth pushing the envelope ahead of what may or may not come in final compensation in the final settlement to try and give as much assurance as possible to protect the sector. I don't think you would have ordinarily expected the budget to have started with pushing me pushing the envelope at a technical level from 170 odd million to nearly 200 million in social care in 1 year. I probably can't say any more than that because it would otherwise reveal too much of our hand in terms of what will ultimately be commercial negotiations. But there is very much a heavy part of the rationale behind the decisions that Cabinet members informing proposals yet to make the decision on it, which have weighed upon them, very much pushing the envelope for understandable reasons, which is why I've said my piece, but also recognise why they've chosen to do it. Councillor.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, then from our last meeting, we sent a letter out, and in it had numerous questions for place, some for social services and some for education. We have had some of the replies from social services and from education. I haven't had the replies from place, which were an example would be pricing for car parks, the cost of the market, the school crossing patrols, things of this nature. We haven't had feedback from our last inquiry about that, the scrutinising of that budget. As for this particular meeting, there are a couple of questions I'd like to ask, and they refer to Appendix A of the report, which is the column which on page 93. I start off by saying there's a reduction in the education budget, non-delegated budget of 20,000. We will ask a question about that. That's the central funding one. There are a couple of other things, and I think one of the things that would be helpful is if you look at the capital finances charges, principal repayment retains the same as 15.574 million. Net interest charges has dropped from 21 to 18 million. That's a drop of 3 million. Is there a reason for that, or is it a repayment issue? I think that's one issue. I think the other thing, which obviously is not really in our control, but one which I think we need to think about, and that is in the financing, the revenue support grant has gone up considerably, but the national non-domestic rate, in other words, the distribution of the business rates as it used to be, we've less than £1 million, and I think that's concerning, because that is an indication of what the national take is. So on those couple of issues, if we could have some answers, and I hope that we can have the other answers ready for council in a fortnight's time.
So if I may take them in order, Chair, I have reminded Cabinet Office, which is coordinating from CMT colleagues, those asks that are due to you by the 20th. It is unfortunate they couldn't bring it forward and answer all of them in advance. They're not technically yet late. You won't get them for today, but rest assured, I have reminded colleagues you need answers to all of those questions. Leader and I answered a number of them, but we wanted to defer to colleagues. So that is very much on the radar. The education one is an interesting technical one around the non-delegated element. It's quite simple. There is £1 million switched from non-delegated to schools delegated for additional learning needs spend, because there's a report to Cabinet which is then asking for a top slicing of schools' budgets to pay for additional learning needs. So in compensating schools sufficiently for the additional learning needs provision, it's why there's a technical change. There's no effective reduction in the education budget. The two are combined, and it's one of those complex interplays between additional learning needs only. In terms of the interest reduction, I go back to what I've said, both in terms of the overarching advice on the revenue budget, but also the MTFP. 2 years ago, we outturned at £17 million underspend on capital financing because of the differential between borrowing at 1% and lending it out at 6%, which has dropped to 5%, which is now going to drop to 4.5%. In setting the 24-25 budget, Cabinet recommended to Council, and Council agreed it to take £2 million a year out of capital financing. This round proposes taking 3 million temporarily, which then drops to 2 million to 1 million to 0, simply banking some of the anticipated savings in year because of that differential between lending out at variable rates way above what we borrowed at temporarily, because the money we borrowed will be spent ultimately on the capital programme. So that's why you see that drop. It's not to do with debt repayment. It is purely booking some of the short-term gain on lending out money at higher rates than we borrowed it at temporarily until we end up deploying it on capital. And then the final one, in terms of NNDR, you're right to spot it. It's nothing to do with our collection rate. That is the NNDR redistributed back from Welsh Government in terms of the split in AEF. And it has been a long-standing position for many years now that RSG has grown and NNDR has been very, very flat. That can be indicative of a relatively anemic assumption over business growth. It is also a decision by ministers as to what the NDR multiplier is. And frankly, when that goes up by inflation, which is 1%, and councils face 6% inflation, it means it differentially falls on revenue support grants. And it is further impacted because Cabinet also on Thursday is going to receive another report from me. It's going to be the 7th year in a row of the temporary retail leisure hospitality rate relief scheme, which for Swansea alone will see nearly £7 million worth of reductions to bills for businesses, being a 40% reduction for all eligible businesses that have got retail and leisure activities. If ministers make a decision to hold the multiplier down to no more than 1.7% CPI, if ministers decide to make changes to the small business multiplier, if ministers decide to continue a scheme, which I totally get why, to try and support retail businesses, and they give them 40% cash back, that all results in depressing significantly the redistribution back from the non-domestic rating pool. We merely are the collection agent. If all the levers are set in such a way as to make that very, very flat, it all falls on RSG, and anything else ultimately falls on council tax. So hopefully that's given you enough of an answer on all of those. Quite a range of different topics, but I felt able to answer all of them, including the education one, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. I think that's it. I don't think any of us has got any other questions. When I find my paperwork. Right. If that's all, can I thank you very much for your attendance? Oh yeah, I'm going to come on to that now. We're now going to come on to the capital programme. And when I put my computer back on, all it is. Capital programme, and Leader, would you like to start off?
I'll leave Mr. Smith to do the technicals on this one. I'm sure there'll be questions that I'll deal with politically.
Okay, Mr. Smith.
So again, briefly, yes, we are back to a very, very large capital programme for the general fund. It's back over £500 million. It includes factoring in a number of those wave 1, 2 and 3 sustainable communities for learning for schools programme. Those are indicative. Outline cases have gone forward. They are not fully approved or funded because it is subject to an individual business case by business case. So you've got that sloshing around in the later years in one of the appendices around schools funding. Cabinet took a decision in year to support a bid for outline applying for over £400 million worth of schools funding over the next 9 years. Those are indicative only. The rest of the capital programme you should recognise. There are degrees of reprofiling. There are a number of large-scale items in year, some of which were confidential but are now revealed in year because the budget is the budget. And the last time I checked, I didn't work for MI5. So the reality is once a decision has been made on agreeing a sum, some of which are commercially confidential at the time at which Cabinet makes a decision and rightly the public and press are excluded, they have to be in the budget when they're set. And the big picture remains that you are living off surplus cash and internally borrowing, and it remains the case set out in this report, as it has been for several years, that you have deferred borrowing the money for the Mumblesea defences, 25 million, and you have deferred £50 million for predominantly regeneration schemes, but there are other schemes in there as well. And decisions taken by Cabinet in year, in public and in camera, have now exhausted those elements of headroom. I will have to at some point externalise the debt, which has been factored into the MTFP and the revenue budgets. Any further aspirations will be subject to individual FPR7 reports coming forward and a decision based on officer advice as to affordability or not, and Cabinet decisions as to how they may afford them if I can't find an appropriate jam jar to fund them. So the message remains the same: large capital programme, elements of deferral, elements of slippage, includes those well known about items, but do not underestimate many of those schools ones are at the moment indicative, aspirational. They will be subject to full business cases as well as just the outline business case for what's gone through and what's called sustainable communities for learning. It remains therefore a very significant unsupported borrowing ask, and the timing of it will be key. But as I've advised on the other items, because we are cash rich and I need resource cover, I'm able to do a lot of internal resourcing like many other authorities. I think we're just able to do it on steroids, frankly, at the moment, short term, and it is logical to defer borrowing until rates drop significantly. My nervousness in the early reports is, will they drop fast enough for me to be happy? But it's the logical thing to do. It's consistent with everything else. It just shows the scale of ambition and aspiration. And there are some big numbers in there, and I'm sure you will have questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Leader, would you like to say anything?
I think Mr. Smith's covered it. Again, I'm sure we'll have the debate about what's in the capital programme, which is where we'll get into the detail a bit. But no, I agree with Mr. Smith. It remains a very substantial. I think Mr. Smith will confirm. I think we're still in the top 3 in Wales in terms of capital spend, and members will know that, as Mr. Smith said, we have aspirations to take forward the next phase of 21st century schools, or whatever the programme is called, to make sure that we deliver significant investment into our schools in due course. But a lot of that detail is not yet known.
Okay, thank you, Leader. Councillor Black?
Just a question. I'm not surprised from the top 3 because we're one of the 3 biggest councils, of course, so I would expect that. Yeah, I know. Just one question. On my agenda is page 138, which is the Skyline allocation. We've allocated £8 million over 2 years for Skyline. I haven't seen an FPR7 report, so I'm just interested, what is that £8 million spend? Is it loan? What is the intention of that £8 million which has been allocated, given that we had assurances that the council would not be spending money on this particular project?
To make sure I don't say anything in public session that is still on yellow papers, I'll cede to Mr. Smith to answer the technicals on that one.
So it's partly what I alluded to a whole raft of items where I do need to tread carefully. There are a number of exempt items and a number of commercially sensitive items, but in terms of setting a budget and having something to spend against, I have to put some numbers in. So I deliberately only refer to the planned spend. I will equally remain extremely coy on the package of the overall funding support, but it remains a mix of items. You should not assume it is all borrowing. I can't really say any more than that. It is one of those difficulties I have on all of those sensitive live schemes which are subject to commercial confidentiality, commercial agreements, where I have to translate some of the items which are on yellow pages into a public document. You can't set a budget without them being on paper in the public document. So I regrettably will be as equally coy as the leader in terms of in public sessions saying what the mix is, but it is to set out a planned level of overall spend. The funding sources remain at the moment on yellow pages, unfortunately, so I can't go any further.
Okay, I understand that. We have had assurances in the past that although we may lend the money to Skyline and we may buy land, which we would hope to get the money back on, that we would not be subsidising the scheme. So the question, therefore, is that still the case?
So I am happy to answer that one, but without going into the detail of what's in the yellow papers, I am satisfied as your Section 151 officer that though when viewed over the lifetime of the scheme, including what has been set out on previous yellow papers and which will be set out in no doubt in future exempt papers, that I am satisfied that overall it is able to be done with no overall subsidy. Short term there may be degrees of subsidy, but I remain satisfied that it is a credible case and will continue to be so when updated exempt papers are brought forward. So you should still continue to be assured that I believe over the lifetime of elements of the package deal, there is no subsidy locally. Again, I can't say no more because I'm trying to steer between what's exempt and what is reasonable for public discourse and debate, which I do get, Councillor Black.
That assumes that their business case works out as it's been set out, of course.
Of course, subject to the sensitivities and the assumptions as to tolerances in it, because it's only as good as the business plan and degrees of tolerance. But you're right.
Leader?
Yeah, I would. So,
Yeah, I got it.
There an interest, sorry.
An interest.
Yeah, because Alpha's mentioned a few times in the report.
Oh,
It's got
right.
something pending.
Mhm.
Do you know what pending is? But there's so
Yeah,
many
it's
schools
the
here.
point. It's the point I was referring to, Councillor Jones. The whole raft of those back phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 sustainable communities for learning. The new £400 million worth of schemes. Many of them are in because there is outline business case submission to Welsh Government, but they have not been approved on a case by case basis. So pending gives you a clue. They're the ones that are in the shadow lands of. We hope to be agreed on a case by case basis in due course, but are not currently as formally committed as other items. Each individual decision on each individual school will need to come forward to ultimately be fully adopted in once Welsh Government and ourselves consider each item on a case by case basis. It's a consequence of this 9-year outline rolling plan, years in advance, all the way through to 2033, of which Alford just happens to be one that's in earlier. So that's what it is. I don't think you've got any. You'd only have a. You might want to declare personal interest because it affects the school that you're a governor on, but there's no prejudicial interest in it. I mean, it's just the reality. I mean, there's a whole raft of schools listed and named, and a whole raft of you could be affected otherwise. But it's those that are in that indicative outline 9-year rolling programme that takes us through to 2033, which still feels like quite a lifetime away, let alone the 2077 debt.
Leader?
yeah, Chair, I was just going to suggest that given what we just encountered with Councillor Black's questions, I think if members have had reports on yellow papers where they have a lot of this information already, that perhaps if we're going to ask questions about those types of capital schemes, it might be better for us to store them up and do them in a private session, so that there's a better opportunity to do them, rather than inadvertently either the member or myself or Mr. Smith place in public domain information that we shouldn't place in the public domain because we've inadvertently released information that would be commercially confidential.
I agree with that, but I also have to say to you and to Mr. Smith that the fact is we're here to scrutinise the budget, and we need to understand what is not and what is in the in the public domain, because we've had a briefing for a number of projects that we were told were in the camera. Now, that being the case, I think we need to understand that before these meetings, so that we don't spray, give out information which is confidential. So I think I understand what you say, but I think we need to talk to our colleagues in legal, or Mr. Smith needs to talk to his colleagues in legal to get the definitions of this sorted out, because this is about the second or third time, and you know yourself, we came into one where we may have to go into private session, but again, we didn't. But I think there is an issue about this, and we need to clarify it as soon as possible.
Chair, if I may come back in, there's two bits at play here. The monitoring officer will give proper advice as to the reason for an item being exempt or not, and the need to go into private session. But for the avoidance of doubt, I recognise the position you've stated, which is for items to be on the public record and in the budget, I have to publish them in this budget report. I might be coy as to what some of the components are, and that still may require a private session and proper monitoring officer advice as to the reason for going into exempt session. But although I jest when I say I don't work for MI5, the only way you can have an approved budget is if the papers are published with total figures in. The trick is trying to get them at a level that it is appropriate to give a degree of disclosure. I can do no more. And the reality is the capital programme is large, and was to the wire in terms of publication. And I see no other route. I cannot have items that are redacted. They might be legitimate for being individually considered yellow papers and exempt, but there is no basis for not putting them in the budget, because otherwise it doesn't exist in the public domain. It is an incredibly difficult position because we have a large number of such items and a large number of items in year. But I am satisfied that I have no option but to publish them in the budget. I do accept it may limit some of the ability to fully question them in public session, but we're going to be bound by ultimately the monitoring officer's decision on exempt items for the individual items. But they clearly have to be in the budget, otherwise they don't exist and there's nothing to spend against. It is a difficult one, and one that the monitoring officer and I have weighed heavily, but on balance we felt we had to disclose what was in these papers. It doesn't otherwise make any sense. You can't have here be dragons for items in the budget.
I perfectly understand what he's saying, Mr. Smith, and I think everybody else understands what he's saying. But we have an obligation to the public to actually, and you have an obligation to the public, and the monitoring officer has an obligation that these figures are released. But I think there is obviously an underlying rationale to what these figures are and what the costs are of various projects. So, and I think we need that conversation about when these total figures can be released to the public and how we can discuss them in a meaningful way in a scrutiny board. I think that discussion we need to have with yourself and the monitoring officer, and possibly the leadership as well, because it needs to understand that we get asked regularly about why is so-and-so costing so much, or what is the cost of so-and-so. We can't then turn around and say, no, this is why, or this is why. So I think that discussion we need to have, and it may need to take place in a constitutional working group, or it may need to take place somewhere else. I have questions from Councillor Mike White.
Yes, Chair, thank you. It's just for the point of clarity with Councillor Blackridge regarding the topic you mentioned. You know, I think, you know, seeing this topic could as well probably a pending planning application coming in. We obviously, myself, Councillor Black and Councillor Jones are members of the planning committee. So do you think that we perhaps should be asking a question in that area?
I would think we're asking about finance, we're not asking about planning really. So I think there's so totally different issues. But again,
I would agree, Chair. I would agree. I mean, you've got, it goes back to the point you made well, which is you have to be able to legitimately discuss items here. And that's the reason why I've chosen to publish the entire budget. It is entirely separate to the planning process. Otherwise, you end up tying yourself in knots. I'm quite happy that I'm on the same page as yourself. You are only making decisions on indicative amounts in the budget for budget purposes. Yes, you always need to tread carefully in terms of that quasi-judicial process, which is planning, but that's almost separate to this and incidental to this for the purposes of setting a budget. Sorry to have interrupted, Chair.
No, that's quite all right. Sorry, Councillor Paxton Hood-Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just wondering whether I should be declaring an interest here at the moment, because as Chairman of the Local Access Forum, that forum has made a submission to the planning department in terms of the planning application in terms of
Can I refer back to?
Pardon?
Can I refer you all to the fact that we are talking about the finance element of our budget, Swansea City Council's budget. If there's an issue about planning, it's not about finance. So I think if we're talking about finance, then that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about planning.
I understand what you're saying, and basically it is about planning, but I was just wanting to query to make sure that I didn't need to make a declaration at this point in time. Okay.
Right. Anyone else?
Can I make a small comment in terms of
By all means.
the capital budget? Obviously, the capital budget for social services is comparatively small in the scheme of things. But having said that, about 80% of it is concerned with providing residential homes within Swansea, because we're not now allowed to use private homes. That is proven to be a problem, not just in terms of funding it, obviously, because it's got to be paid for, but also in finding appropriate accommodation that we particularly can purchase and modify to suit our purposes. Just wanted to make a point at this time of time. it is difficult. It needs to be looked at. Let's see what we can do.
Peter?
Yeah, just on that point, I think, look, the principle of not making profit off children's care is one, I think, that is supported. What we are seeing, though, is obviously some providers deciding if they can't make profit in the way they previously did, that they don't wish to offer the service any longer. I've been an advocate of a national care system and care service for some time. I think this is moving in the right direction, but the speed at which we move in that direction has to be managed effectively. Otherwise, you will have insufficient provision. I think, again, as we went through the budget process, it's clear now for the first time in quite a while, the council is actually a cheaper provider than the private sector alternative in these areas because of the Eliminate programme. And again, you know, personally, I would quite like to see us take a much bigger share of the adult social care market because 75% of that is delivered through the independent or private sector. So again, you know, it's one of those ones where I think public services can play a much bigger role in delivery of that. And I would like to see local government deliver more social care services directly. That is something I've been on record about saying for some time. And I think, you know, a number of other leaders in the same boat. But you are right to point out the fact that we need to continue to invest in facilities as we grow our provision to look after children who would have previously have gone into independent or private care facilities.
Thank you. I completely understand what the leader is saying, and that aspiration was put forward many, many years ago, that we looked at the children's services as well as elder services to some extent, that we looked at if companies are making a profit, fair be it, fair so, but it is how much that profit is and what is the manner of the funds. But there we are. That's for something for above our pay grade, unfortunately. Can I, if that's all the members, can I ask Mr. Smith a couple of questions on Appendix B on page 133? I think it's important we understand what this page indicates. If you look at the total general fund financing, and I think it's important that we realise that if we go down the sections, each individual section, you've got the community learning band, you've got the city centre deal scheme fundings, and then we got phase 2. And you'll see the unsupported borrowings are in the region of 9 million for the city deal for central phase 1, and then we've got central phase 2 is 10 million, and at the end the total unsupported borrowing requirement, including the 21st schools, I have to say that will be 162 million, and I think that obviously is in over a period of time. So I think to ask you, Mr. Smith, given the separation of these particular issues, do you think that the way it's laid out there is a fair assumption to say that it's a bit more complicated than may be necessary, and we could have if we could have a method by which we would say what we are borrowing in supported borrowing and what we what we're borrowing unsupported borrowing, and the effect that has on revenue in a far more simpler term for members to understand what the difference is. Thank you.
So incredibly difficult for me to make it any simpler because it is complicated. You're right, there is £162 million showing there. That should not come as a surprise in terms of unsupported borrowing. You have already been told by me that there is £50 million of predominantly regeneration schemes deferred but not yet funded, 25 million for Mumblesea defences, and I indicated that the report that went to Cabinet, which sought outline approval for over £400 million worth of band waves 1, 2 and 3 sustainable communities for learning, required £112 million worth of local contributions, which is a combination of capital receipts, revenue, but a significant amount of unsupported borrowing. You are right, there's a distinction between supported and unsupported borrowing. The supported borrowing is the element that nominally is funded within revenue support grant. I say nominally because they choose a rate of interest and they decide again on a pro rata basis to allocate it across authority. So it doesn't actually relate to anything particularly. In the same way, borrowing is not undertaken on a scheme by scheme basis. The capital programme is financed as a whole, so there is no way of breaking it down. The sum totality of everything that members ultimately decide at council to approve as the capital programme will be funded from a variety of sources. And the reality is, once every other source has been used up, the only thing that's left is unsupported borrowing. So that figure for unsupported borrowing is consistent with the assumptions I've made elsewhere. It will become a bit clearer when the further reports come, which is the Treasury Management Strategy Statement and the Capital Strategy. They go direct to council. I've not yet seen the final versions of them because until we get to a point where we can draw stumps on a revenue budget, which is dependent on Welsh Government, and decisions for Cabinet to recommend to council, I can't work out what the final position is. In terms of the level of assurance, you should see wash through, and there is wash through because that level of unsupported borrowing is due to come. As I indicated, short term, there are savings in the revenue budget on capital financing and a use of capital equalisation reserve, both to prop up revenue for the reasons I discussed and also to smooth the cost of capital financing. But in that MTFP report, I take you back to the advice I gave, which is unequivocally, you see very, very substantial end loading of costs of capital financing, both in terms of the temporary stuff unwinding, the drawdown of internal cash and the need to externalise that borrowing. Now, the assurance you can get is that I have presented on a technical basis an MTFP that balances over the lifetime, but requires those planning decision assumptions as set out in the MTFP to hold. If they don't hold, then it's not affordable. But on the basis that at the moment, the planning assumptions which I have set out, which Cabinet will discuss and recommend at Council, and Council will make its decision in due course, if, not prejudging what may happen as a result of all of the iterative processes, ultimately Council approves the MTFP and the revenue budget and the capital budget. They lock together on that basis and they work, but it is incredibly difficult for me to do anything other than the way it is presented. I can't think of a simpler way. Unfortunately, the capital financing, and as you and I jest repeatedly, ultimately the treasury management stuff really is the school of dark arts. I do my best to make it simple. I can't see a way of making it simpler. Ultimately, you have to rely to a degree on your treasurer to make his best endeavours or her endeavours on the treasury management activity, and that's why you delegate all decisions to me. Get it right, you make millions. Get it wrong, you lose millions. Fortunately, up to now, we've got it right and made millions. I wish I could answer more positively, but I cannot see with the resources available to me and the complexity of our programme how I could make it any simpler in terms of trying to explain how all of the various bits interlock. They do at a macro level, and ultimately you're looking for certification from me. And that is one of the reasons why I was a bit sniffy on my Section 25 certification or modification on revenue. I've already said it, so I won't repeat it particularly to sort of say it's reasonable, but it does have consequences in terms of the longer term play. That's probably all I can say, Chair. I wish I could come up with a simpler way of explaining it. If it was that simple, you wouldn't need people like me to try and explain it to you. I'm not trying to be cheeky. I hope you won't take it as being cheeky.
Well, thank you, Ben, and I do appreciate, and I think we all appreciate the fact that you've done a very good job acting in the dark arts, which obviously you are an expert at. Let's be blunt about it. If you go on to Appendix C, just a few simple questions for you now. I noticed that in Director page 139, there's apologize, it wasn't 39. It's on page, well, it doesn't got a page number, but it basically says pardon? Oh, sorry, 138, sorry. It got the St. Helens Ground redevelopment 25-26 4.1 million. Have we agreed that, Leader?
So again, it's another one on yellow papers, Chair. So again, the details of the arrangements for St. Helens Ground are there. I think the figure that Mr. Smith has put in is an indicative figure that could be invested, but it's subject to conditions laid down by Cabinet, which you will have seen on your yellow papers that went to Cabinet.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier on about the difference, but I think That's the capital. Are there any other questions on this item? If not, can I move on to the housing revenue account and the revenue budget? No questions on that? Oh, yes, sorry. Oh,
Yeah.
Ben, do you want to introduce the housing revenue account?
For consistency, but very, very quickly, the housing rents are capped as a result of Welsh Government legislation. They're 1% above CPI when CPI was 1.7%, so you can't go higher than 2.7%. The inflationary and service pressures and aspirations far exceed that, which puts pressure on the HRA account. There are also some operational risks that all 11 authorities that have got a housing stock face on a national basis, and that is the reason why you ultimately have decisions based on technical advice to myself in conjunction with the relevant head of service to set the proposals out in front of you. There are pressures on the housing revenue account. They strike a balance. It's still a position where significant sums of revenue are ploughed into the joining capital programme that you're going to discuss next. But for operational technical reasons, I have required as the Section 151 officer reserves to be beefed up in the housing revenue account to protect council's interests. Again, many of these things become sensitive. They're not on yellow pages, these items, but there are always a number of risks and issues that affect all authorities, where sometimes there is regrettably, again, a bit of the dark arts in the background. But rest assured, I have tried to strike an appropriate balance, and Cabinet has listened, and Cabinet members have listened as have officers, in striking a balance between trying to build up HRA reserves for a perfectly legitimate and logical reason. And if some of those risks that the HRA face go away, we may be able to revert back to a more normal position. I think it's at the margin when you look at the overall capital programme for the HRA of hundreds of millions and the amount that ultimately gets ploughed back into improving the stock. But there are some tensions. The social aspirations about limiting rents for price control reasons, understandable, but at the same time, Welsh Government have very significant aspirations, as does the council, around improving the stock. And it is what it is, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the reserves because on Appendix 1, there were two issues which seemed to me quite puzzling. First of all, under the revenue funding for capital schemes, the amount of money set aside in the budget for next year is a good £7 million less than the current year, even though we have a very ambitious house building programme, and we're buying up former council houses, where we've got a very ambitious refurbishment programme of our existing stock, and yet we seem to be borrowing less or paying back less in terms of revenue for the capital programme on that. So that was one issue. And the second issue, I don't fully understand why it is that we are putting an extra £5 million into reserves. I mean, what can you actually say about that? Because it just seems to me that doesn't seem to make much sense.
So
Yeah,
I can say something. Should I go first, leader?
You go first, Mr. Smith. That's fine.
So this is again where members are, of course, in charge. They are always in charge, but they are legally obliged to follow my statutory advice. And my statutory advice includes weighing up a whole pantheon of risks that affect all 11 HRA stockholding authorities and the wider housing sector. I can assure you there is an absolute rationale for why there are risks. There are contingent liability risks that affect the HRA, and I have required a degree of rationing and holding back. It will indeed look perverse, I get entirely that, but there are reasons for it. My job is not just to look at today, but to look at all the risks downstream, whether it be provision, contingent liability, other risks, and to give advice. And I've had to give that advice, which all treasurers are facing and all local authorities are facing. And there is a rationale as to why we have to ration elements of it. All local authorities are disclosing a contingent liability in their draft accounts, and I am convinced they will continue to do so for the 24-25 accounts, pending a number of Pan Wales legal matters still to be resolved. So I'll say no more than that. I'm more than happy to defer to yourself, leader. But again, I'm treading an appropriate balance. It's really difficult. You want to have public discourse, but there are commercially sensitive, there are legal matters. Rest assured, this one does not affect only Swansea, and it is still a very, very substantial capital programme, significantly boosted by still very substantial revenue contributions to capital outlay.
Okay.
But in terms of the revenue contribution to capital being £7 million less, is that to do with interest rate slippage or?
No, it's purely to enable me to engineer putting the HRA reserves to a level that I'm prepared to certify them as safe and lawful. I've given Section 25 advice on the general fund. The Section 25 advice is to make sure you don't get into worse territory of running the risk of being in deficit on the general fund. The same rules apply to the HRA, and whilst I believe it to be a theoretical risk, I have at all times to legally ensure that the HRA runs no risk of ever being in deficit. And it's that drives it. The only way that I can enforce effectively, I like that word, but I can't think of a better one, that forces reserves to a level that they need to be, at least temporarily until some of those risks are diminished, is to cut back on revenue contributions to the capital programme, regrettably.
Okay, Leader?
Yeah, just to add to what Mr. Smith said, the risks that Mr. Smith alluded to there are not one specific to Swansea, although they potentially do have an impact for us. They are related to legal matters, and again, just to reassure, whilst we will pay due regard and have paid due regard to Mr. Smith's advice, which is why we have the paper before us, at the point at which those risks are therefore dealt with, the intention would then be to move that money back into the delivery programme and to move schemes forward. That's the point in terms of the scoping of the programme. So should we be in a position to be able to move money back into the capital programme, that is what we would seek to do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think that concludes all our... No? I thought that was a capital programme. Oh, then we go on to the capital programme. I thought we had done that. There we are. Sorry. Right, the capital programme on HRA, on the housing.
Yeah, on page, I can't even read the page number now. 165. There's the amount of money put in for the general environmental scheme. In the current year, it's £700,000. In the next year, it's £70,000, which is a 90% reduction in the amount of money made available for general environmental schemes. Now, my understanding was, well, the explanation later on is that money is there for where there are health and safety issues. And also, of course, the housing quality standard also has an element of environmental work attached to it. So I am concerned that by reducing that budget by so much, there's a lot of schemes which are being planned for next year will not now go ahead. So I'm just asking whether or not there is scope to reinstate that budget, or what the reason is for that budget being cut by so severely.
So regrettably, I'm not able to answer that one. That one
No.
will need to be a follow-up to housing, but it may well be driven by some of the general comments I've made about needing to make some arrangements to ration elements of the capital programme. I would endorse what the leader has said. Once those, I believe them to be theoretical risks, once they have gone, it would be with my consent that we would return to a more normal, significant HRA capital programme, but I can't answer the specific on that one.
It's not a huge amount of money, but I think it can make a big difference in various estates.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Black, can you point me to which paper you're looking at? Sorry, I missed the reference.
Leader, it's page 165, and there is clearly a line saying in general environmental improvements. I can see Councillor Black's point that it goes from 700 down to 70. I can see it clearly on screen, so I'm not able to answer it.
I think that relates, but I will be corrected, but I think that relates to things like garden changes at the present time, ones that are not health and safety related, but I will check it. I think the principle that we've adopted in looking at the budget in the HRA has been those schemes where we're committed to them, where we've taken them to the point of appointment, where live works are in progress, and where it would be costly to get out of them or defer them. Those are the ones that we are obviously progressing. So we've taken a pragmatic view on that. Inevitably, given that we're having to hold back a little bit of money until the legal issues are dealt with, that some of the schemes in there are obviously profiled backwards. But the aim, as I said in the previous answer, would be where that risk is then reduced, we can then profile them forward again with the hope of getting them done more quickly. So again, it's a reprofiling exercise that has taken place here with the aim still to do the works, but to do them later until the risks are reduced.
It isn't soft landscaping. This is to do with hard work. For example, lay-bys. There's one in my ward where Brondeg Crescent, where there is a square which is very unsafe for people with wheelchairs, which was going to be resurfaced next year, which may now fall by the wayside. And there's a couple of other schemes like that. So this is a state-based hard work hard landscaping work, which I think will have an impact if it's not done next year. And I think if you can reinstate that budget, it would be much appreciated if you could have a look at that, Rob.
Happy to take a look at that, but at the present time, I'm not able to give that commitment.
It's only a query. It's on the same page, I think. I'm afraid I'll lose it when I move. It's 165, yeah. On the very bottom, it says More Homes, Gower Road. Is that the one in Calais, or is it somewhere else? Because we don't know of any more homes in Calais. Thank you.
I'll take that one away and check.
Okay, is the housing revenue account under the capital account now finished? If that's being the case, right, can I thank you, Leader, and thank Mr. Smith for his attendance in this meeting about the budget. Obviously, we're going to have a conversation now about what should be in the report to Cabinet on Thursday, and look forward to seeing a pair of you on Thursday morning.
Thank you,
Okay.
Chair.
Right. What we're proposing is that we put together a letter and a piece. We'll send it out to all of you for your approval before we send it out. We would like to possible to send it out by 4:30 tomorrow afternoon, and if you could respond as soon as possible, because I have to take it in on Thursday morning. Okay. Are there any particular points that members would like highlighted on to the budget on Thursday?
I'd definitely like to highlight that point about the housing capital link.
Okay, we'll do that. I think there is a general point I think we need to make, and that is the fact about the public money, and we can't discuss what is happening with the sums of money. You know, we borrowed a huge amount of money, we're investing it in properties and buildings, and we can't discuss it because of the restrictions. So I think that's primarily, I think, what we should be saying on Thursday about the fact that, you know, we can't discuss these items if they confidentially, if they're commercially confidential, and yet it is public money and the public have a right to know what's happening to that money. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing we need to say is to back up what Mr. Smith said with regards to the equalisation fund. You know, it was designed to smooth out the capital, and now we're using it to bolster the revenue to make sure the council tax is somewhat lower by the sounds of it. But there are a couple of other things in there which I think we need to look at, but those are a couple of things we need to think about. Fun? Which I have done and tried to do in the past and have failed to do. But fun? We tried to pass that in a couple of council meetings every time they've had a budget. We've wanted to take money out of the equalisation reserve.
Now they're doing
the
it.
council contracts. Now they're doing it. But anyway, there's that. And there's a few other things that I think we need to look at. But what concerns me more than anything, and as I brought up earlier on, we asked a lot of questions in the last scrutiny board with regards to, you know, savings. And one of the ones is the pricing for car parks. All the fees for births and deaths, marriages up by 12%. We asked all these questions and we haven't had any replies. So I think that's something I will bring up on Thursday as well. And I think the other thing is about the cost, the indicative costs that's in this budget for some of the projects that are coming up. And one of them, which I can't get over, is St. Helens, about the £5 million. Nobody had ever said that before. Skyline, of course, these other things which have been brought up here. And I think although we can't mention the exact amounts or whatever, but I think it is possible that we say on Thursday what's in the budget. Yeah. And I think those are the issues. As for the council tax, I think that's something for another place, a political argument. But the actual workings of the budget, I think we must make it abundantly clear that what's in the budget we must be able to talk about. Okay?
I just find that I know there'd be reams of paper, but I find it very difficult to follow this budget because they only seem to have headlines and not what we used to have underneath years ago. And I said this every year, we're just looking at headlines and trying to guess what work has gone on before to arrive at these figures. So I don't know if you can make a point somehow that we just don't get enough paperwork before the meeting to actually understand what's been put in and what's been rejected, you know, choices.
Stand, there's another meeting at 4 o'clock here. Okay, thank you all.